Hi everybody, I'm Don Dickson and I want to welcome you back to another edition of our master class on the mechanics of fishing. Last time we talked, I gave you an example of the importance of speed control. We actually talked in detail about there's really two controls in fishing that we have to be concerned about every day we go fishing. It'd be depth and speed. And we sort of isolated, even though these two things go together, we sort of isolated and gave some scientific background on why speed control and where speed control and so on and so forth. And I'm going to continue that a little bit today because I didn't feel like we were completely finished with it. So here's a hand rule I want to leave you with on speed. Now we're going to be talking more about speed, and I'm giving you another example today, but I wanted to at least give you this hand rule so that we know about all of the whys of speed and the where of speed and so on and so forth, and the what speed. And here's the hand rule that we're going to use. As the temperature of the fish's environment increases, our speed increases. And as the temperature of the fish's environment decreases, our speed will, along with that, decrease. That's the hand rule that we use. And again, we're going to be using some parameters. We have to have an idea of what we think the speed might be during the course of a day. Just like that last example I gave, we knew it was freezing cold early season. We knew the speed control was going to be slow on those white bass. We just didn't know how slow. But then there was a great example of how quickly it can change. So as we view in speed control on a daily basis when we go fishing, we never know exactly what it's going to be. So we're going to set up some hand rules for you to follow, understanding that each and every day we go fishing, we don't know what that speed's going to be. We're going to have some ideas. If it's winter, early spring, late fall, we have some decrease in the temperature of the fish's environment, we're going to have a slower speed control. If it's the middle of August at noontime, it's going to be faster. But we never know exactly what speed is going to turn the trick on any given fishing day. We just have an idea. So in the end, we're going to constantly have to check different speeds during the course of any fishing day until we arrive at the right speed for that particular time. So with that being said, I wanted to give you another example of speed control and bring up another point. Again, we're going to deal with some of the science behind what speed, why speed, so on and so forth. And what I didn't bring up the other day, which is important, the different species of fish do in fact have some different idiosyncrasies. And some fish are known as fast. Other species of fish are known as the slower fish. I want to tell you a story that involves walleye. Walleye, as we already know, is a slow fish by nature. His nature is to be slow. Now, of course, just like any other fish in the summer months, he speeds up as the temperature increases. He'll speed up, and as the temperature goes the other way, he'll slow down. But normally, we think of a walleye as a pretty slow fish. And a bass, on the other hand, very fast. He's the other side of the fence, as well as a northern pike and a muskie. They're very fast fish. So our parameters, as we're thinking in terms of what speed control today, it's going to depend on structure type. It's going to depend on weather and water conditions. It's going to depend on the season of the year. And it's also going to depend on what species we're looking for. So with that in mind, I'm going to tell you a little story about a walleye situation that not only was something that was important to me as far as my learning, as far as my reinforcing the importance of speed control to me. And it would help me in my teaching and teaching others down through the years, but also was extremely important in the success of my summer schools. Let me tell you what happened. Now, keep in mind, when I tell you this story, I don't want to take any credit for coming up with something new. But I did sort of come up with something new in its application, at least, that even Buck wasn't doing. But it was only because of everything that Buck taught me that this came to light and it came to be. And and it eventually happened. And in later years, of course, I've been teaching it as a regular part of our presentation of lures. And here's what happened. Many of you who have been studying the structure thing with us, we talked about going to do our first summer school, Buck Perry's School of Fishing, on the water. And it was on the Winnipeg River, Lake of the Woods up in Ontario. And we also used in our description of structure that there was a beautiful saddle that we found up there that had some terrific break lines. One at 37, one at 42, one at 47 feet, dropping into 60 feet of water. And we caught fish on both sides of that saddle. We also had a big bar that was connected to the saddle that, I don't know, we caught something like, I don't know, I'm estimating we caught over the years probably 10,000 walleyes off of these two structures. I mean, I can't even imagine how many it was, but it was a bunch. Hundreds each and every week, the hundreds of big fish we were catching. And we were fortunate that seasonally these walleyes were coming down through this area where we were doing the school. And for a period of some 7 or 8 weeks, they were there. The fish were there. So catching, especially once we had mapped that structure, once we located it, and once we had a detailed map of it, and as each and every group of students come through there, we were using it as a training site. So we ended up just catching like so many fish, it was silly. Now, most of the time, these fish would become active during the course of a day. And many times they would become active but never move shallower than 37 feet. They would be active downstairs. And it's relatively early season. Up there, we were there in the second half of June and most of July. And that's still not the heat of the season for them. But those fish were in their summer patterns, obviously. And they would become active, but they wouldn't move any shallower than 37 feet. But since we were equipped to fish that deep, and we had structure that we could read that deep, we would be successful all the time, just literally all the time. So after 4 years of running that school up there, I can tell you that we would bring people up there and introduce them to the wire line, fishing with wire line, because we had to fish between 35 and 60 feet. We had to be using wire line. So we introduced everybody to wire line, and when we connected the wire line to the spoon plugs, most of the time people would think, well, gee whiz, that might be a little bit fast fishing for these river walleye down in those deep depths. A walking spoon plug might be too fast. Well, never thought of it because it never was too fast. And one of the things that helped us out was we were always fishing, upstream. We were fishing against the current. So we could continue moving our boat and working our lure at the slowest walk we could possibly do. And still keep it moving. Thanks to the current. I hope you understood that. At any rate, for 4 years, for 6 or 8 weeks, we were catching walleye like crazy. 37, 42, 47 feet. Sometimes at the base, we were catching them at 60 feet of water. They get active and we catch them, but they never move shallower than those depths. So most all of the time, in order to catch those fish, we're trolling spoon plugs on wire line, and we're using the solid Manel wire. We'll talk more about that in tools, but we introduced everybody to the use of wire line. It gives us another dimension in our fishing. The whole point is that here we were for 4 years catching these fish on spoon plugs being trolled downstairs on solid Manel wire line. So it became almost such an automatic thing that I sort of quit thinking about it. We just use it as a training area, and guys and gals catching fish like they never caught before, and they're working with wire. It added a whole new dimension to their presentation. Now even the most experienced trollers could see and experience catching fish, big fish, downstairs where they can only fish it with wire trolling line. So it opened up a whole new ball game. I even wrote an article once. I said the future, in my opinion, the future of fishing, a big part of it's going to be wireline. You need to get it. You need to learn how to use it so you can effectively fish all of the depths at all of the speeds. Now, this brings me to my story. After 4 years, catching fish, automatic, using it as a training area, all of a sudden, in the 5th year of our schools, we're trolling the spoon plugs like we've been doing for 4 years downstairs, and we're catching an occasional fish, but not lots of fish like we did originally. I spent a week of looking at the water and establishing where we'd have our fish and so on and so forth. I always go up a little bit early. In this particular year, I believe it was 84, I wasn't catching very many fish. And I thought, well, gee whiz, could be a daily thing, or maybe seasonally they're not quite here yet, or, you know, I sort of wrote it off to one of those reasons. And then the first week of students showed up, and we had a great school. We did a lot of training. Smallmouth were spawning, and a lot of smallmouth were caught and released, just having fun with that. And there were quite a few walleyes caught, but it wasn't near like it used to be. And I was a little bit concerned about that. I was hoping it would pick up. I was hoping more fish were moving into the area for the second week of school, because we had 6 or 8 weeks of school to do. And in the second week, it even got slower. We weren't catching our walleye on our saddle and on our big bar. Now, keep in mind, we could read this structure. It's gorgeous structure. We could read it at 37, 42, and 47 feet. So I know, just like Buck knew those white bass were up there, I knew my walleyes probably had to be there, but I wasn't catching them. Nor were my students catching them in their free fishing time. They're catching occasional fish, but not a bunch. So I was really concerned, and in the second night of that second week, a friend of mine from Minneapolis, his name is Dr. Jerry Barnes, great guy. He was one of those guys that everybody just loved him. You know, he's just a good guy. And he was a young dentist and a good fisherman. He had caught a lot of fish. And he lived in Minneapolis, so he was a walleye guy. I mean, he loved fishing walleye. And we were having dinner that night, and we were just talking about how things that's sort of slowed up this year, and we weren't catching like we normally were. And I said, but I'm convinced those fish are in there. And I was sort of lamenting to Dr. Barnes that I wish I could cast these spots so I could really check that slower speed. And he mentioned something to me that basically was sort of life-changing. He said, you know, my grandfather taught me, I was growing up fishing with him. We were fishing a lot of shallow rivers in Minnesota for walleye. And he said he used to use this old river rig, this something called river rig. And he said, I've used that before. It's kind of like, you know, you're sort of like horizontally jigging. Opposed to jigging like this, you're sort of jigging a trolled lure this way. And I said, I know about river rig. I said, my grandfather used to river rig, and they'd go really slow, you know, they had that motor going about as slow as you can go, and they pull the rod forward and drop it back. And I said, you know, I never thought about it till you just mentioned it. I said, but, you know, I wonder why we couldn't put that idea of river rigging together with our wire line setup. And I was thinking that if I could be trolling forward, which is what the old river rig idea was supposed to be, you could keep trolling, but when you drop your rod back, you're creating kind of a zero speed control. So I got to thinking, man, that might, you know, that something like that might work with our wire line if we could rig up a river rig idea, get our lure down with a weight in our wire line, and start that vertical or horizontal jigging motion, we could create a zero speed control. I said, it's worth a try. I'm going to work at that. So over the next couple of days, I did. I got some bell sinkers, and I went into this little town about 30 miles away and bought some bell sinkers, located some bell sinkers. I got different weights, 2, 3, 4 ounces, and I set up this dropper system. I brought my wire line. I put a leader on my wire line, of course, like I would with a spoon plug. But instead of snapping on a spoon plug, I snapped on this dropper weight of about 18 inches. And then I put a 4-foot leader back and tied a lure to it. My idea was to get enough weight to get down into these deep depths with a current now. I didn't know how much it was going to take, so I had to play with it a while. And I used different line lengths for dropper weights and different line lengths for my lure. And I finally arrived at, I could do a really nice job with my wire line if I used a 4-ounce dropper weight on about 18 inches. And then I put a 3-way swivel right there. And then I went back this way, a 4-foot leader, and put a floating lure on it. Now, I didn't want a diving lure because my weight and my wire line was going to give me my depth control. But what I wanted was a lure that would continue to work in the current, just like Buck's little wiggle tail was working for those weight bass. I wanted a lure that would work in the current. And since we were fishing downstairs, I wanted it to be a big lure, something that the fish could see. So I thought a minnow type lure like a Rapala. I had some Rapalas in the box. Stick bait, like a minnow bait. And the floating version, I thought that would be terrific because it would continue to work down there. And as I sunk it down to the bottom, as I brought my rod forward, I would pull all that stuff together, including that floating lure. And then when I eased my rod back slowly, the weight would go back down, hit the bottom, but my lure, which would come forward with me as I'm pulling it, but when I'm dropping my rod tip back, the lure would actually at one moment come to a 0 speed control. In other words, I was creating in 47 feet, in 42, and 37 feet of water, I was creating what Buck was creating in 2 feet of water up at Lake Pepin. A lure that was basically at a 0 speed control, but still working. And at the same time, I'm still covering my structure. I'm trolling forward, but as I maneuver that rod, pull it forward, drop it back, just like my old grandpappy used to do, that Rapala would all of a sudden, it would go like this. Imagine it now, it's forward and then come to it'd come to a dead stop. But it's still wiggling, it's still working. It's still alive, even though it's not moving from point A to point B at that moment. And that moment is all it took. That created a 0 speed control. Jerry and I went out together after I had checked what seemed to work the best as far as the leader lengths and all of that and how much weight we really needed to get down. And we spent an entire morning fishing. We loaded the boat. We caught a fish every pass. We had 1 or 2 fish on. They were stacked in there big time, just like the white bass were stacked up at Lake Pepin. But our speed control was off. Now, 95% of the time, I'm trolling with a spoon plug and a speed control. I can do all of my fast stuff and almost all depth or speed control down to 0. I can't do 0 speed with a spoon plug. And all of a sudden in Menaki, that 0 speed control was what was needed. So now I had to start teaching everybody this new system of river rigging with wire line. And the results over the next 5 years were staggering. And it wasn't until my wife and I went back up there one late summer, and we were fishing that area. We know seasonally it wasn't ideal, but we were catching our fish on spoon plugs. We were there in September, catching them all on spoon plugs. And that's when my wife caught her 13-pounder in 60 feet of water. And a slow walk on a spoon plug was fine. But during the summer months, for 4 or 5 years, the river rig would catch 10 fish to every one that we caught on a spoon plug. So it was just another example of where the fish were there the whole time. They were there. But our speed control was just a little bit off. And once we were able to control that zero speed and still cover the structure, we loaded the boat. And so did all the students. They picked up on it. My wife learned how to do that in about 5 minutes. And she learned how to keep that lure just right, where you'd have to feel the weight hit when you drop it back. When you feel the weight hit, you immediately bring it forward, ease it back till the weight hits. And if the weight wasn't hitting, you had to drop a little more line. And the only problem with some of the students where they end up putting too much line out and dragging some wire and wade along. So you had to be just right with it. But once you got that technique, river rigging with wire line for walleyes, I'm telling you, the results were staggering. So it was just something else that we're adding to our repertoire of creating a depth and speed control. Now keep in mind, if I'm running a river rig in 25 feet of water and all the fish are in 60 feet, I'm not going to catch them. My speed could be right, but my depth control was wrong. And we can reverse that. So keep in mind, we're going to be talking about depth and speed control at the same time. But in the case of my Menaki structure, I knew what my features were: 37, 42, and 47 feet. And then I could fish the base break line at 60 feet. I had my structure, I had my depth, and I knew the fish should be there, but I wasn't catching. The answer was speed control. And it didn't matter if I was catching them at 37 feet or at 47 feet. The river rig would produce where the spoon plug only occasionally produced, but that was a unique situation that it was completely different for the first 5 years, and the 5 years after that, the slower speed was needed downstairs fishing for the walleye. So now you have a couple examples of slow speed control making a difference. One was in the shallow water, one was in extreme deep water, but speed was the answer. In this case, it was slow speed. Now, most of the time, and this will be sort of a leader for our next discussion when we're going to talk about depth control. We're going to talk about it in depth. We're going to talk about depth control. But it's almost an absolute true statement to say, unequivocal, you cannot fish too fast for a bass, most likely. And most fishermen, as a general statement, most fishermen fish far too slow, or slowly. I have to check with my English teaching son. But most guys are fishing too slow. You have to speed it up. Bulk of the season, summer months, those fish get so fast that you can't believe it. And I'm going to show you some examples of just how fast a fish can get. And that includes the muskie, includes the northern pike, includes stripers, it includes largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, and especially the bass. They get so stinking fast that most people, when they see me trolling sometimes in the summer, they think I'm going across the lake, but really what I'm doing is fishing. They just can't believe how fast that you need to go sometimes on the other end of this spectrum. And keep in mind as we leave today, we leave this discussion today, speed control, we never know exactly what it's going to be. But we have to use all of our knowledge of a fish, the basic movements, our interpretation of weather and water, our seasonal movements, and all of that knowledge that we're putting up here. We got to put that to use and then apply it over to what's the depth and speed control needed today in order to put fish in the boat. So I hope that made some sense to you today. I hope you're enjoying this beginning talk. We're going to talk more and more and more about it. The depth and speed control, because now we have to also talk about what tools do we use to control depth and speed, all of the depths and speeds. We've mentioned a couple of things already. So we need to be using the right tools. And then we're going to talk about presenting lures and casting and trolling. And all of that comes down and plays a part in this discussion on depth and speed control, the two things that are needed to catch a fish. So as I close today, let me use that statement again. Buck says, and don't ever forget it, Buck says, all fishing success and all fishing failures can be described in two terms, depth and speed. If you caught fish, your depth and speed was right. And if you didn't, either your depth or your speed, or both was not right. So until we talk the next time, like us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and I appreciate you being with me, and we'll see you the next time.